Every week, I dialed my son's number hoping to hear his voice, not just his demands. But each time, it was the same: "Mom, can you send more money? No, hello, no, how are you?" Just a cold transaction drenched in disappointment. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 75 years old. I live in a small one-bedroom apartment on Grand Concourse in the Bronx, where the walls have absorbed decades of my hopes and tears. The radiator clanks every morning at 6, a sound that once annoyed me but now serves as my alarm clock. The smell of café con leche from the Dominican bakery downstairs mingles with the musty scent of old photographs scattered across my kitchen table. These photos tell the story of a life I thought I was living, but now I wonder if I was just surviving. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, I would sit in my worn velvet armchair, the one my late husband Frank bought me for our 20th anniversary. The fabric had faded from deep burgundy to a tired rose color, much like my own spirit. I'd hold my old flip phone in my trembling hands, staring at David's number. David, my only child, my pride and joy, the boy who once brought me dandelions from Central Park and called them sunshine flowers. I'd dial those 10 digits I knew by heart, my finger pressing each number with the hope that today would be different. Today he'd ask how I was feeling. Today he'd remember that I existed beyond the money in my bank account. The phone would ring once, twice, sometimes 3 times before he'd answer with that familiar tone of impatience. "What is it, Mom?" Not, "Hi, Mom." Not, "How are you feeling?" Just, "What is it?" as if my call was an interruption to something far more important than the woman who gave him life. Last Tuesday was no different. The autumn wind rattled my windows, and I could hear Mrs. Rodriguez from Forby playing her novellas too loud again. I dialed David's number, my heart racing the way it always did when I was about to hear his voice. When he answered, I took a deep breath. "Hi, sweetheart. I just wanted to, Mom, I need $800 for my car payment. Can you send it today?" $800. Just like that. No pleasantries, no concern for my well-being, no acknowledgement that I was a human being who might have feelings or needs of my own. I sat there in silence, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the traffic outside my window. A siren wailed in the distance, and I wondered if anyone could hear my heart breaking. "David, I called because I wanted to talk. I've been feeling, look, Mom, I'm really busy. Can you just send the money? I'll call you later." He never called later. He never did. The line went dead, and I sat holding that phone for 10 minutes, staring at the black screen as if it might magically bring back my little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares. Instead, all it brought was the crushing weight of realization that I had become nothing more than an ATM with a voice. I shuffled to my kitchen and made myself a cup of tea with shaking hands. Earl Grey, the same brand Frank and I used to share on Sunday mornings when we'd read the Times together, him with the sports section, me with the crossword puzzle. Now the tea tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway because there was comfort in the routine, even when everything else felt broken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself looking through my photo album, the one with the cracked leather cover that smelled like my mother's perfume. There was David at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fishing rod that was taller than he was. We'd gone to Coney Island that day, just the two of us, because Frank was working overtime at the factory. David caught 3 tiny fish and insisted we throw them back because they probably have mommies who miss them. I touched the photo with my fingertip, wondering where that sweet boy had gone. When did he stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as his personal bank? When did my love become something to be exploited rather than cherished? The questions haunted me, but the answers were harder to face than the silence from my son. You see, I hadn't always been this way, this desperate for connection, this willing to buy love with dollar bills. There was a time when I had boundaries, when I believed in respect and reciprocity. But somehow, over the years, those lines had blurred until I couldn't tell where my love ended and my exploitation began. Let me tell you about the sacrifices. Let me tell you about the years I gave everything I had, believing that love meant never saying no, never asking for anything in return. It started when David was 23 and fresh out of college. He moved to Manhattan, got a job at a marketing firm, and called me with excitement in his voice. For the first time in months, he sounded happy to hear from me. "Mom, I got the job. I'm going to be living in the city, just like we always dreamed." I was so proud, so full of joy for him. But then came the requests. First, it was help with the security deposit for his studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen. $2,000, nearly half of my savings from my years working as a school secretary in Queens. "It's just until I get my first paycheck, Mom. I promise I'll pay you back." I sent the money without hesitation. Of course I did. What mother wouldn't help her child take their first steps into independence? But the payback never came. Instead, there were more requests. Help with his work clothes. Money for his subway card. Assistance with groceries because the cost of living in Manhattan was higher than he'd expected. Each time, he promised it was temporary. Each time, I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I worked 2 jobs then, my full-time position at PS 89 during the day and cleaning offices in Midtown 3 nights a week. My hands were raw from scrubbing floors and washing windows, but I told myself it was worth it. I was investing in my son's future. I was being a good mother. The winter David turned 25 was particularly harsh. Snow piled up outside my apartment windows, and the city seemed to move in slow motion through the gray slush. My arthritis flared up, making it difficult to grip the mop handles during my cleaning jobs, but I pushed through the pain. David needed help with his rent again. "Mom, they're raising the rent on my place. I either need $1,500 or I'll have to move back home." The threat was subtle but clear. Send money, or deal with having your adult son move back into your 1-bedroom apartment. I scraped together the money from my grocery fund and a small investment account Frank had left me. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for 2 weeks to make up the difference. "You're an angel, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." Those words made the hunger pangs worth it. For a moment, I felt needed, valuable, loved. But as the years passed, the gratitude became shorter, the requests became demands, and the promises to pay me back became automatic lies we both stopped believing. I remember one particular conversation when David was 28. I'd just been diagnosed with diabetes, and my doctor had prescribed medication that my Medicare didn't fully cover. I needed $400 a month just to stay healthy, but I hadn't told David about my diagnosis. I didn't want to worry him. He called on a Thursday evening, just as I was measuring out my rice portions for the week, small servings because I'd spent my grocery money on his latest emergency. "Mom, I need $2,000. My girlfriend and I want to take a trip to Miami for her birthday." A trip. Not rent money, not an emergency, not a necessity. A vacation. I sat in my kitchen, looking at my pill organizer full of medications I could barely afford, and something inside me shifted. For the first time, I hesitated. "David, I don't know if I can." "Come on, Mom. Don't be difficult. You know I'll pay you back." Difficult. The word stung like a slap. Since when had asking for consideration become difficult? Since when had my financial limitations become an inconvenience to my own son? But I sent the money. I always sent the money. I cashed out another piece of Frank's investment portfolio, the one that was supposed to be my safety net, my security for when I got too old to work. That night, I found a picture of Frank in my jewelry box, the one from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls. He was laughing at something I'd said, his arm around my waist, both of us young and full of dreams about the family we'd build together. I pressed the photo to my chest and wondered what he'd think about what I'd become. The investments Frank had worked so hard to build, stocks he'd researched carefully, a modest portfolio that had grown steadily over the years, were disappearing bit by bit. What had once been a small fortune, enough to keep me comfortable in my old age, was being transferred dollar by dollar into David's accounts. Even the small amount of Bitcoin Frank had bought as an experiment in his final years, worth considerably more now, had been sold off to fund my son's lifestyle. Would Frank be proud of me for supporting our son so generously? Or would he be heartbroken to see me giving away our financial security for someone who never seemed satisfied, never seemed grateful, never seemed to see me as anything more than a source of income? The exploitation was so gradual, so carefully wrapped in declarations of love and promises of reciprocation, that I didn't notice how deep it had gone until I was drowning in it. By the time David turned 30, I'd given him over $50,000. Money from my retirement savings, money from selling Frank's watch collection, money borrowed against my apartment. Each transaction was supposed to be the last one, the one that would finally set him on his feet so he could stand independently. I kept track, you know. In a small notebook hidden in my bedroom drawer, I wrote down every amount, every date, every promise of repayment. The numbers added up to more than I wanted to acknowledge, more than I could afford to lose. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way the requests came. No warm-up conversation, no interest in my life, no recognition that I existed beyond my ability to solve his problems. He'd call, ask for money, and disappear again until the next crisis arose. The silence between his calls stretched longer and longer. Weeks would pass without any contact, and I'd sit by my phone wondering if something had happened to him. Had he been in an accident? Was he sick? Had he moved and forgotten to give me his new address? Then the phone would ring, and my heart would leap with relief and joy, only to sink again when I heard the familiar opener. "Mom, I need." Never "Mom, I missed you." Never "Mom, I was thinking about you." Always "Mom, I need." I started to dread the phone ringing as much as I craved it. The manipulation was subtle at first, so gentle I almost didn't recognize it. When I'd hesitate to send money, David would remind me of all the things he'd done for me over the years. The Mother's Day flowers he'd sent when he was 25. The time he'd helped me move furniture when I was 68. The Christmas visits that became shorter and less frequent each year. After everything I've done for you, Mom, this is how you treat me? I'd end up apologizing, feeling guilty for even questioning his requests. How had I raised such an ungrateful son? What kind of mother was I to put my own financial security before my child's needs? But were they needs, or were they wants? The line had become so blurred I couldn't tell anymore. The financial pressure was crushing me slowly, like being buried under an avalanche, one snowflake at a time. My heating bills went unpaid some months because I'd sent David rent money. I skipped medical appointments because I couldn't afford the co-pays after funding his latest emergency. My own needs became secondary to his wants, and somehow that had become normal. I remember the morning I realized I'd been buying groceries with credit cards for 3 months straight. I stood in the cereal aisle of the Associated Supermarket on 149th Street, holding a box of oatmeal I couldn't afford, and I started crying right there between the Cheerios and the corn flakes. An elderly man with kind eyes asked if I was okay, and I couldn't even answer him. How do you explain that you're 73 years old and choosing between food and medication because you've given your son your entire future? I put the oatmeal back and bought rice instead. Plain white rice that I could stretch for days, the same thing I'd eaten as a child during the hardest times when my parents struggled to feed us. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was eating like a poor child again in my old age, not because of bad luck or economic hardship, but because I'd chosen to impoverish myself for someone who saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. But still, I sent the money. Still, I answered his calls with hope in my heart that maybe this time would be different. The pattern continued for years. David would call with increasingly elaborate stories about why he needed money. His car had broken down. His landlord was threatening eviction. He'd lost his job through no fault of his own. Medical bills from a mysterious illness he never wanted to discuss in detail. Each story tugged at my heartstrings, each crisis seemed urgent and legitimate. I was his mother, wasn't it my job to help him through difficult times? But I started noticing inconsistencies. He told me he lost his job, but then mentioned going out to expensive restaurants with friends. He needed money for medical bills, but his social media posts showed him at music festivals and sporting events. Social media. That was where the cracks in his stories really started to show. I'd learned to use Facebook to keep in touch with some of my former colleagues from the school, and through them, I discovered David's accounts. What I saw there broke something fundamental inside me. While I was scraping together rent money to send him, he was posting photos from rooftop bars in Manhattan. While I was eating rice and beans to afford his emergency requests, he was showing off expensive meals at trendy restaurants. While I was wearing the same 3 dresses I'd owned for a decade, he was buying designer clothes and vacationing in places I'd never even dreamed of visiting. The worst part wasn't the lies, it was the realization that he knew I could see these posts. He knew I would see the evidence of how my money was really being spent, and he posted anyway because he didn't care. He knew I'd keep sending money regardless of what I discovered, because I'd already proven I would. That was the moment I understood I wasn't a beloved mother being temporarily helped by her son. I was a mark being worked by a con artist who happened to share my DNA. But understanding the situation and having the courage to change it were 2 different things entirely. The worst part was the special occasions, the birthdays, the holidays, the moments when families come together to celebrate and show love. These became the times when my exploitation hurt the most, when the silence from David cut deeper than any harsh word could have. My 74th birthday fell on a Tuesday in March. I woke up that morning with a flutter of hope in my chest, thinking maybe David would call early to wish me well, maybe even suggest we meet for lunch somewhere in the city. I waited by the phone all morning. I'd made myself a small cake, just a box mix from the dollar store, but I'd lit a single candle and made a wish that this year would be different, that this year my son would remember I was more than a source of funds. By noon, no call had come. By 3 o'clock, I'd eaten half the cake standing at my kitchen counter, washing it down with bitter coffee and tears. By evening, I'd accepted that he'd forgotten entirely. At 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Need $300 for utilities. Can you send tonight? Not, happy birthday, Mom. Not, sorry I forgot. Not even the courtesy of calling from his own number. Just a demand from a stranger's phone, as if I were some kind of customer service line he could contact for money deposits. I sent the money. God help me, I sent it, because even that cold, impersonal request felt like contact with my son, and I was so starved for any acknowledgement of my existence that I'd take even that. That night, I sat in my armchair looking through old birthday cards David had given me over the years. His handwriting had been so neat as a child, his messages full of love and gratitude. You're the best mom in the world, he'd written when he was 8. Thanks for everything you do for me, when he was 15. I love you more than words can say, when he was 21 and about to graduate college. Where had that love gone? When did it transform from genuine affection into calculated manipulation? Christmas was even worse. I'd sent David $500 in November to help him buy presents for his girlfriend's family, people I'd never met, people who would receive gifts bought with my money while I sat alone in my apartment with a small artificial tree I'd bought from the Salvation Army store. I'd invited David for Christmas dinner, offering to make all his favorite foods, the way I used to when he was young. My grandmother's recipe for meatballs, the special stuffing he'd always loved, the apple pie that Frank used to say was better than anything from the fancy bakeries in Manhattan. I'll try to make it, Mom, but Sarah's family is having a big thing, and it's really important for my career that I'm there. His career. Always his career, always something more important than the woman who'd sacrificed her own career advancement to support his education. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold. I'd set the table for two anyway, hoping against hope that he might surprise me. I'd spent 3 hours preparing food that would end up lasting me a week, cooking enough for a family gathering that never materialized. At 2 o'clock, I got a text, "Can't make it today. Something came up. Can you send $400? My card got declined. Something came up." On Christmas Day, something was more important than his mother who'd been cooking since dawn, who'd been hoping for just a few hours of his company. I sent the money and threw away most of the food I'd prepared. The smell of the wasted meal filled my apartment for days, a reminder of how little I mattered in my son's life. But the absolute worst was when I got sick and realized how completely alone I really was. It started as a cold in February, but it developed into pneumonia that left me bedridden for 2 weeks. I'd never felt so weak, so frightened, so aware of my own mortality. My fever spiked at 102, and I lay in my bed shivering despite 3 layers of blankets, wondering what would happen if I didn't recover. I managed to call David from my bedside phone, my voice barely a whisper. "David, honey, I'm really sick. I've been in bed for 4 days, and I'm scared. Could you maybe come check on me, or help me get to a doctor?" There was a pause, and I heard music in the background, the sound of people laughing and talking. "Mom, I can't deal with this right now. I'm at a work event. Can you call your doctor or something?" A work event. While his mother was potentially dying alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, he was at a party and couldn't be bothered to leave early. "David, I think I need to go to the hospital, but I can't afford the ambulance. Look, I'll send you $200 for a cab or whatever, but I really can't talk right now." He hung up before I could respond. $200 for a cab to the hospital, as if money could replace the comfort of having your child care enough to make sure you survived. I never went to the hospital. I couldn't afford it, even with his $200, and my pride wouldn't let me call an ambulance I couldn't pay for. Instead, I sweated out the fever alone, drinking water from a mason jar beside my bed and praying to Frank's spirit to help me survive. Mrs. Rodriguez from 4B found me on day 6, when she noticed my mail was piling up outside my door. She brought me soup and called her grandson, who was studying to be a nurse, to come check on me. These strangers, people I barely knew, showed me more care and concern than my own son had. When I'd recovered enough to call David and let him know I was okay, he didn't answer. When he finally called back 3 days later, it wasn't to ask about my health. "Mom, I need $800 for my car insurance. Can you send it today?" No acknowledgement of my illness, no expression of relief that I'd survived, no apology for his absence during what could have been my final days. Just another demand, as routine and emotionless as asking for the weather report. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not broke, cracked, like a window that's been hit by too many stones and is finally ready to shatter completely. I sent the money, but for the first time, I also asked a question. "David, do you love me?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Of course I love you, Mom." "Why would you ask that?" "Because I can't remember the last time you called just to talk to me. I can't remember the last time you asked how I was feeling, or told me about your life, or spent time with me without needing something." Another pause, shorter this time. "Mom, you're being dramatic. I'm just busy with work and life. You know I love you." But did I know that? Did I really? Because love wasn't supposed to feel like this, desperate and one-sided and conditional on my ability to solve problems with my checkbook. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at my bank statements, really looked at them, adding up exactly how much money I'd given David over the past 5 years. The number was staggering. Over $75,000, money from my retirement account, money from selling Frank's collectibles, money borrowed against my apartment's equity. What had once been a comfortable nest egg, enough to see me through my final years with dignity, had been reduced to less than $10,000 in savings. I was one major expense away from poverty, and my son didn't even know it because he'd never asked about my financial situation. He assumed the well would never run dry, that I'd somehow always find another source of funding for his latest crisis. But the well was almost dry. Soon, there would be nothing left to give, and then what would happen? Would he finally come to visit me when the money ran out, or would he simply disappear entirely, moving on to find another source of support? The thought terrified me more than dying alone in my apartment. At least death would be quick. Being abandoned by my only child, being discarded once I was no longer useful, that would be a slower, more painful death of the spirit. I started having dreams about Frank, vivid dreams where he'd sit on the edge of our bed and shake his head sadly. "Maggie, what are you doing? This isn't love you're buying, it's abuse you're funding." I'd wake up crying, because even in my dreams, I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Frank had raised David too, had loved him just as fiercely, but Frank would never have tolerated what I was tolerating. Frank had understood the difference between helping someone up and enabling someone to walk all over you. But Frank wasn't here to help me find my backbone. Frank wasn't here to remind me that I deserved better than this. Frank wasn't here to hold me while I grieved for the son I thought I'd raised, the son who seemed to have been replaced by a stranger who saw me only as a resource to be exploited. I was on my own, and I was drowning. The discovery that finally broke everything came on a Thursday evening in April. I'd been having trouble sleeping, so I decided to take a walk through my neighborhood, something I hadn't done in months. The spring air felt good on my face, and for a few minutes, I remembered what it felt like to exist in the world instead of just surviving in my apartment. I stopped at the small market on 161st Street to buy some fruit, a luxury I rarely allowed myself anymore, when I heard familiar laughter from the next aisle over. I turned the corner and found Mrs. Santos, a woman I'd worked with at the school, talking animatedly on her phone. "You should see the video Elena posted," she was saying. Her son's birthday party looked amazing. That restaurant must have cost a fortune, but they looked so happy. Something in her tone made me pause. Elena, I knew that name. Where had I heard it recently? Mrs. Santos noticed me and smiled. "Margaret. How lovely to see you. I was just telling my daughter about the party video Elena shared. You know Elena Rodriguez, right? Her son David works in marketing." My world tilted. Elena Rodriguez. David's girlfriend's mom. The woman I'd heard about but never met, whose family celebrations were apparently more important than Christmas dinner with me. "What video?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Oh, it's on Facebook. Elena's daughter Sarah had this incredible birthday celebration at some rooftop restaurant in Manhattan. The whole family was there, including Sarah's boyfriend. They looked like they were having the time of their lives." Sarah's boyfriend. David. I made an excuse to Mrs. Santos and hurried home, my hands shaking as I opened Facebook on my old laptop. It took me several tries to find Elena Rodriguez's account, but when I did, what I saw destroyed the last remaining pieces of my heart. There was David, laughing and raising a champagne flute in a toast. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, an expensive-looking thing that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Sarah was beside him, radiant in a dress that sparkled under the restaurant's lights. The table was covered with elaborate dishes, bottles of wine, a massive birthday cake that looked like it came from one of those fancy bakeries in Soho. But it wasn't just the obvious expense that broke me. It was the date stamp on the video. March 15th. 3 days after my birthday. 3 days after he'd texted me asking for utility money from a stranger's phone. 3 days after I'd sat alone eating dollar store cake while he was celebrating at a party that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I scrolled through more photos, each one a knife in my chest. David looking happy, genuinely happy, in ways I hadn't seen him look when he was with me in years. David surrounded by people who seemed to care about his opinions, who listened when he spoke, who included him in family celebrations without asking him to pay for the privilege. At the bottom of the post, Elena had written, "So grateful for David's generosity in making Sarah's day so special. We're blessed to have such a thoughtful, caring man in our family. David's generosity. With my money. My 74-year-old grocery fund had paid for that party, for those champagne toasts, for the designer clothes and fancy restaurant. I was funding my own son's performance as the perfect boyfriend for another family while I sat home alone wondering why he never had time for me." The comments under the photos were full of praise for David. "What a gentleman. Sarah is so lucky. You raised her right, Elena, she found a keeper." I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen for 3 hours, not moving, barely breathing. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not peaceful, but empty. Not restful, but hollow. That night, I did something I'd never done in my 74 years of life. I got angry. Not sad, not disappointed, not confused. Angry. I was angry at David for lying to me, for using me, for treating me like an ATM instead of the woman who'd given him life. I was angry at myself for allowing it, for being so desperate for his love that I'd funded my own humiliation. I was angry at Frank for leaving me to deal with this alone, even though I knew that wasn't fair. But most of all, I was angry at the situation, angry that loving your child completely and unconditionally had somehow become an invitation for them to exploit you without consequence. I pulled out my notebook, the one where I'd been tracking every dollar I'd given David, and I did the math one more time. $78,000 over 5 years. Nearly $16,000 a year. More than $1,000 every month, going from my poverty to fund his luxury lifestyle. I thought about all the things I could have done with that money. The trips I could have taken, the medical care I could have afforded, the security I could have maintained. I thought about the hot meals I'd skipped, the medication I'd rationed, the heat I'd kept low during brutal New York winters, all so David could buy champagne for people who were already rich enough to afford their own celebrations. But it wasn't really about the money, was it? Money can be earned back, saved again, managed differently. What couldn't be recovered was the time, 5 years of phone calls that were really just shakedowns, 5 years of hoping for love and receiving invoices, 5 years of Christmas mornings alone while my son celebrated with families who appreciated him because I was paying for his contributions to their happiness. What couldn't be recovered was my dignity, my self-respect, my belief that I mattered to the person I'd loved most in this world. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. I decided to stop. Not gradually, not conditionally, not with negotiations or ultimatums. Just stop. The next morning, I called my bank and removed David's name from my accounts. He'd had access for years, just in case of emergencies, though the emergencies had become a weekly occurrence. I opened a new savings account, a small one with the little money I had left, and I made it accessible only to me. Then I sat down and wrote a letter I'd never intended to send. David, I love you more than my own life, but I can't continue to fund a relationship that only exists when you need money. I'm 74 years old, and I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to spend it with people who see me as more than a source of income. If you want to have a relationship with me, a real relationship, with conversations and shared meals and mutual respect, I'm here. But I won't be sending any more money. Not for emergencies, not for celebrations, not for anything. I hope you understand, but if you don't, I'll have to accept that too. Love, Mom. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and addressed it to his apartment. Then I sat holding it for 2 hours, knowing that mailing it would change everything between us forever. Was I ready for what would come next? Was I prepared for him to disappear from my life entirely rather than accept a relationship without financial benefits? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't continue as I had been. The woman in those Facebook photos, the one funding champagne toasts for strangers while eating rice alone, that woman was disappearing $1 at a time, and if I didn't save her soon, there would be nothing left to save. I walked to the mailbox on the corner and dropped the letter inside before I could change my mind. The metal slot clanged shut with a finality that echoed in my chest. Now all I could do was wait to see if I'd mailed a letter to my son or a goodbye to my child forever. 3 days later, my phone rang. I knew it was David before I looked at the caller ID. Something in the quality of the ring felt different, more urgent, almost angry. My hands shook as I answered. What the hell is this supposed to mean? His voice was sharp, harsher than I'd ever heard it directed at me. Hello, David. I assume you got my letter. This is ridiculous, Mom. You can't just cut me off because you're having some kind of breakdown. I depend on your help. Depend. Such an interesting word choice. Not appreciate, not am grateful for. Depend. As if my financial support was a utility he'd subscribe to, like electricity or cable service. I'm not having a breakdown, honey. I'm making a choice. I want to have a relationship with you that's about more than money. We have a relationship. Just because I don't call every day doesn't mean I don't love you. When was the last time you called me without asking for money, David? Silence. Long, telling silence. I'm busy, Mom. I have a career, a girlfriend, a life. I can't be calling you all the time just to chat. I'm not asking you to call all the time. I'm asking you to call sometimes. Once a month, maybe, just to see how I'm doing. To tell me about your life. To act like you remember I exist between crises. This is emotional blackmail. You're trying to manipulate me. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Almost. David, I've given you nearly $80,000 over the past 5 years. I've missed meals to send you rent money. I've gone without heat to fund your vacations. I've cashed out my retirement to pay for your lifestyle. If anyone's been manipulative, it hasn't been me. Another pause, shorter this time. I could hear him thinking, recalculating, trying to find the right words to make me resume the flow of funds. Mom, you're exaggerating. It hasn't been that much money, and I've always intended to pay you back. Intended. But never actually done it. I will pay you back. Things are just tight right now because of the economy. The economy didn't force you to spend $300 on champagne at Sarah's birthday party. Complete silence now. He hadn't expected me to know about that. You're spying on me now? Looking at my girlfriend's family's social media? That's really low, Mom. I'm not spying. Mrs. Santos from the school showed me the pictures because she thought I'd be happy to see you looking so successful. Imagine my surprise when I realized you were celebrating with my grocery money while I sat home eating rice. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, David? Explain to me how it was different from exactly what it looked like. I waited, giving him the chance to offer some explanation, some context that would make sense of what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No excuse could transform the truth of those photos, no words could change the fact that he'd lied to me repeatedly while living luxuriously on my poverty. Look, Mom, I don't have time for this drama. Are you going to send me the money I need for rent this month, or not? Drama. My request for basic respect and honesty was drama. No, David. I'm not. Fine. Don't call me crying when you're sitting alone in that apartment with no one to care about you. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone for a long time, listening to the dial tone and waiting for the tears to come. But they didn't. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a strange combination of emptiness and relief, like I'd just vomited up something that had been poisoning me slowly. He'd revealed himself completely in that final threat. The mask had slipped, and I'd seen the calculation underneath, the cold assessment of my value based solely on what I could provide. Don't call me crying when you're sitting alone, as if loneliness was my punishment for refusing to fund his lifestyle, as if my worth as a human being was tied to my willingness to be exploited. But I wasn't crying. For the first time in months, maybe years, my eyes were completely dry. That night, I slept for 10 hours straight, the deepest sleep I'd had since Frank died. I woke up to sunlight streaming through my windows, and for a moment, I couldn't remember why I felt so different. Then it hit me, for the first time in 5 years, I was going to start a day without wondering when David would call asking for money. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Of course, the silence didn't last long. David had learned over the years exactly which buttons to push to get what he wanted from me, and he wasn't going to give up easily. The texts started the next week. First, they were angry. Thanks for abandoning your only son when I need you most. Then they became pleading. Mom, I'm really struggling. Can't you help me just one more time? Then manipulative. I guess I know where I stand with you now. Sarah's mom would never treat her daughter this way. Sarah's mom. Elena Rodriguez, whose Facebook posts had revealed the truth about where my money was really going. The woman whose family got to enjoy my son's presence at celebrations while I funded his contributions to their happiness from afar. I didn't respond to the texts. Each one that arrived felt like a test of my resolve, and surprisingly, my resolve felt stronger with each attempt to break it. But David wasn't finished. He understood me well enough to know that anger and guilt might not work, so he tried a different approach. 2 weeks after our phone call, I received a long email that began, Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, and I realize I haven't been the son you deserve. For a moment, my heart leaped. Was this the breakthrough I'd been hoping for? Had he finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him? I read further. He wrote about how sorry he was, how grateful he felt for all my sacrifices, how much he loved and appreciated me. He promised to do better, to call more often, to spend more time with me. He painted a picture of the relationship we could have, long conversations, family dinners, mutual support and affection. It was everything I'd wanted to hear, every word I'd been starving for. And then came the final paragraph. I know I haven't earned the right to ask for anything more, but I'm facing eviction next week. If you could just help me with rent this one last time, I promise things will be different. This will truly be the last time I ask for money. I just need this chance to prove to you that I can change. One last time. The phrase he'd used dozens of times before, always followed by another crisis, another emergency, another urgent need that only my bank account could solve. I read the email 3 times, and with each reading, I could see the manipulation more clearly. It was perfectly crafted emotional theater, the right amount of contrition, the precise level of vulnerability, just enough promise of change to make me believe this time might be different. But this time wasn't different. It was exactly the same, just wrapped in prettier paper. I deleted the email without responding. The next day, I got a call from Sarah. I'd never spoken to her before, though I'd been funding her lifestyle for months through David's requests. Her voice was sweet, young, concerned. Mrs. Patterson? This is Sarah, David's girlfriend. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I'm really worried about him. She went on to explain that David had told her about our misunderstanding, and she wanted to help us reconcile because family is so important. She spoke lovingly about David, describing him as generous and caring, someone who always put others first. He's been so good to my family, she said. He paid for my mom's medication when she couldn't afford it, and he helped my brother with his car payments. That's just the kind of person he is, always helping others. My medication money. My grocery money. My 74-year-old emergency fund had been transformed into gifts that made David look generous to a family that would never know the real cost of his charity. He's just going through a rough patch financially, Sarah continued. If you could maybe help him with rent this month, I know it would mean everything to him. He's too proud to ask, but I can see how much this is hurting him. Too proud to ask. The man who called me twice a week with financial demands was too proud to ask for help. I thanked Sarah for calling and told her I'd think about what she'd said. But as I hung up, I realized something had fundamentally changed in me. 6 months ago, that call would have worked. The idea of David suffering, of him being too embarrassed to ask me directly for help, would have had me transferring money within hours. Now, I could see it for what it was, another manipulation, another angle of attack when the direct approach had failed. They'd even recruited his girlfriend to play on my sympathies, to make me feel like the unreasonable villain in their fairy tale romance. But I wasn't the villain. I was the woman who'd been funding their fairy tale from the shadows while they painted me as the wicked witch who refused to be generous. The calls and texts and emails continued for another month, each one a slightly different variation on the same theme. I was wrong to cut him off, he needed money urgently, this would definitely be the last time, our relationship was more important than money. But never once did anyone acknowledge what I'd actually asked for. Never once did David call just to talk, just to ask how I was feeling, just to share something about his life that didn't involve a financial crisis. Even in his apologies, even in his promises to change, the focus was still on getting me to resume sending money. The relationship he offered was still conditional on my willingness to be exploited, just with prettier words wrapped around the exploitation. After 6 weeks of silence from me, the messages stopped coming. At first, I kept waiting for my phone to ring, kept checking my email expecting to find one more attempt to break down my defenses. But as days passed without contact, I realized David had finally accepted that his old methods weren't going to work. Whether that meant he would find new methods or simply disappear from my life entirely remained to be seen. The silence in my apartment felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. Not lonely, but private. For the first time in years, I could sit in my chair without dreading the phone ringing, without calculating how much money I could afford to send, without wondering what crisis would drain my account next. I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I bought myself fresh flowers from the bodega down the street, just because I liked how they looked in my kitchen. I went to the movies on a Tuesday afternoon, something I hadn't done since Frank was alive. I called my insurance company and scheduled all the medical appointments I'd been postponing because I couldn't afford the co-pays. Slowly, carefully, I began to remember what it felt like to exist for myself instead of just surviving to serve someone else's needs. But the real transformation began when I met Rosa. It was a Thursday morning in late May, and I was struggling with my groceries outside the Associated Market. I'd bought more food than usual, actual ingredients for meals instead of just rice and canned soup, but my arthritis was acting up and the bags felt heavier than they should have. A woman about my age approached from across the street. She was elegantly dressed in a way that spoke of careful choices rather than expensive purchases, a navy blue dress that was clearly vintage but perfectly maintained, a colorful scarf that brought out her warm brown eyes, shoes that were practical but stylish. "Excuse me, dear, you look like you could use a hand." Her voice had a musical quality, tinged with what I thought might be a hint of the South, though she'd clearly been in New York for decades. "Oh, that's very kind, but I couldn't." "Nonsense. I live just around the corner, and these old bones need the exercise anyway. I'm Rosa Martinez." She smiled as she said it, and something about that smile made me accept help for the first time in months. As we walked slowly toward my building, Rosa chatted easily about the neighborhood, about the changes she'd seen over the years, about her garden on the fire escape where she grew herbs and small vegetables. "Are you new to the area?" she asked as we reached my building. "Oh, no, I've been here almost 15 years. I guess I just don't get out much anymore." Rosa paused at the bottom of the steps, studying my face with kind but knowing eyes. "Well, that's a shame. This neighborhood has so much to offer if you know where to look. I teach a cooking class at the community center on Tuesdays, nothing fancy, just good food and good company. You should come sometime." I thanked her for the invitation and for her help, expecting that to be the end of our interaction. But Rosa had other ideas. The next Tuesday, she appeared at my door with a container of the most amazing smelling rice and beans I'd encountered since my grandmother's kitchen. "I made too much," she said with a wink that suggested this was probably not true. "And I thought you might like to try my recipe." I invited her in for tea, and somehow 3 hours passed before either of us noticed. Rosa had worked as a school teacher in Harlem for 35 years before retiring. She had 2 daughters, both living in different states, both successful professionals who called her weekly and visited whenever they could afford the trip. It sounds like you have a wonderful relationship with them, I said, and meant it. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. It wasn't always easy. There were times when they needed help, and times when I had to say no because helping them would have hurt them in the long run. Learning the difference between supporting your children and enabling them, that's one of the hardest lessons of parenthood. Something in the way she said it made me think she understood more about my situation than I'd revealed. Did you ever worry that saying no would damage your relationship with them? Oh, honey, I was terrified. The first time I told my oldest daughter I wouldn't loan her money for a car she couldn't afford, she didn't speak to me for 2 months. But you know what happened when those 2 months were up? She called to tell me she'd saved up enough to buy a used car she could actually maintain, and she thanked me for forcing her to be responsible. Rosa took my hand in hers, her fingers warm and soft. Real love sometimes looks like disappointment in the moment. But if someone only loves you when you're giving them what they want, that's not love at all. That's just business. I found myself telling Rosa about David. Not everything at first, just pieces of the story, testing to see if she would judge me for being so foolish, so easily manipulated by my own son. Instead, she listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, her expression growing sadder but never judgmental. You're not the first mother to confuse love with enabling, she said finally. And you won't be the last. The question now is, what are you going to do with the wisdom this pain has taught you? That question stayed with me long after Rosa went home. What was I going to do with what I'd learned? For so many months, I'd been focused on what I'd lost, David's attention, the illusion of his love, the comfortable fiction that I was helping him build a better life. But I'd gained something too, the knowledge that I deserved better, the understanding that real relationships require reciprocity, the strength to choose dignity over desperation. Rosa began visiting regularly, and through her, I started meeting other people in the neighborhood I'd never noticed during my years of isolation. Mrs. Chen from the laundromat, who gave me tips for getting stains out of clothes I couldn't afford to replace. Miguel from the deli, who started setting aside the day-old bread for me at half price, not out of pity but out of kindness. Mrs. Washington from the bus stop, who shared her newspaper with me some mornings when we waited for the B6 together. These weren't deep friendships, but they were human connections based on mutual respect and small kindnesses. No one wanted anything from me except maybe a smile or a few minutes of conversation. No one saw me as a resource to be exploited. For the first time in years, I started to remember what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. But the real test came in September, almost 5 months after I'd sent David that letter. I was coming home from Rosa's cooking class, we'd made Dominican pollo guisado, and I was carrying a container of leftovers Rosa had insisted I take, when I saw a familiar figure sitting on the steps of my building. David. He looked thinner than I remembered, and there were dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his usual expensive clothes, and his shoes looked worn. My heart did something complicated, a flutter of joy at seeing him mixed with anxiety about what his presence might mean. Mom. Hello, David. We looked at each other for a moment, 5 months of silence stretched between us like a chasm. Can we talk? I've been waiting for almost 2 hours. I unlocked the building door and led him upstairs to my apartment, my mind racing. Was this the reconciliation I'd been hoping for? Had he finally come to his senses and realized what he'd been doing to me? Inside my apartment, David sat in Frank's old chair while I made tea with hands that trembled slightly. When I sat down across from him, he looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. This place is different, he said. He was right. Rosa had helped me rearrange things, add some color, make the space feel more alive. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen table, and I'd hung some of my old paintings, ones I'd done years ago but had hidden away because David once said they were amateur hour. I've been making some changes, I said carefully. David nodded, then looked down at his hands. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered, nervous and unsure. Mom, I owe you an apology. A real one, not like those emails I sent before. I waited, hardly daring to breathe. I've been thinking about everything you said, about the way I've been treating you. You were right. I haven't been a good son. I've been selfish and thoughtless, and I took advantage of your generosity. The words I'd been longing to hear for months. I felt tears starting to gather in the corners of my eyes. I want to make things right between us. I want to have a real relationship, like you said. I want to be the son you deserve. David, that means everything to me. I've missed you so much. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. I've missed you too, Mom. More than I realized. We talked for almost an hour. He told me about his job, about problems he'd been having with his boss, about how his relationship with Sarah had been strained recently. He asked about my health, about my life, about how I'd been spending my time. It felt like the conversation I'd been craving for years, natural, warm, focused on connection rather than transaction. I found myself relaxing, hope blooming in my chest like flowers after a long winter. Then David shifted in his chair and his expression became more serious. Mom, there is something I need to tell you. I've been having some financial problems since you stopped helping me. Sarah and I broke up because I couldn't keep up with the lifestyle she expected, and I had to move to a cheaper apartment in Queens. I felt my stomach tighten, but I tried to stay focused on what seemed like his genuine remorse and desire to reconnect. I'm sorry to hear about Sarah. Breakups are always difficult. Yeah, it's been rough. And the thing is, I'm behind on rent for my new place. I tried to handle it on my own, like you wanted me to, but I'm just not making enough at work. I hate to ask, but could you maybe help me out just this once? I know I don't deserve it after everything I put you through, but I'm really scared I'm going to end up homeless. And there it was. The real reason for his visit, hidden under an hour of what had seemed like genuine conversation and authentic apology. I sat in silence for a long moment, feeling something die inside me. Not hope this time, hope had died months ago. This was the death of the last tiny possibility that David had learned from our separation, that he had grown, that he had come to understand what real love looked like. How much? I asked quietly. $1,200. I know it's a lot, but I promise this is different. I'm not asking you to support my lifestyle anymore. This is just to keep me from being homeless. I looked at my son, this man I'd carried in my body, nursed through colicky nights, taught to ride a bicycle, cheered for at school plays, loved with every fiber of my being, and I saw a stranger. Not because he'd changed, but because I finally saw him clearly. The conversation we just had hadn't been genuine. It had been a performance, a careful setup designed to soften me up for the real ask. The apology, the interest in my life, the promises to be a better son, it had all been manipulation, just more sophisticated than his previous attempts. He didn't want a relationship with me. He wanted access to my bank account with a relationship as the price of admission. David, I said finally, when you were sitting here telling me about your job troubles and asking about my health, were you planning the whole time to ask me for money? He looked genuinely surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, was any of this conversation real, or was it all just leading up to asking me for $1,200? Of course it was real, Mom. I do want to have a better relationship with you. But that doesn't mean I can't also ask for help when I need it. Families help each other. Families help each other. Such a reasonable sounding statement. And it might even be true, if the help went both ways, if the conversations existed independent of the financial needs, if I was seen as a whole person rather than just a potential solution to his problems. David, when was the last time you offered to help me with anything? What do you mean? You never ask for help. Have you ever wondered why I never ask for help? Have you ever thought that maybe I don't ask because I've learned that asking you for anything that doesn't benefit you is pointless? He looked genuinely confused, as if the idea that I might have needs of my own had never occurred to him. But you're doing fine, Mom. You have your apartment, your social security, your routine. What could you possibly need help with? I stared at him, this person who had taken $78,000 from me over 5 years, who had missed my birthday and ignored my illness and treated me like a human ATM, and I realized he genuinely believed I was doing fine. He had no idea that I'd been rationing medication to send him money. No idea that I'd been eating rice and beans for weeks at a time to fund his restaurant meals. No idea that I'd been cold all winter because I'd kept my heat low to afford his rent payments. In his mind, I was just Mom, a magical being who existed to solve his problems, who had infinite resources and no needs of her own, who measured her success by her ability to keep him comfortable. David, I want you to leave now. What? Why? I thought we were having a good conversation. We were having a transaction. You were making a down payment on $1,200 with an hour of fake interest in my life. Mom, that's not fair. I really do want to be closer to you. No, you want me to resume funding your lifestyle. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it wide. I need you to go now. And I need you to understand that I won't be giving you any more money. Not $1,200, not $12, not 12 cents. If you want to have a relationship with me, it will have to be a relationship that exists without any financial component whatsoever. David stood up slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. You're really going to let your own son become homeless over money? I'm not making you homeless, David. Your choices are making you homeless. I'm just refusing to be the solution to problems you create for yourself. Fine. But don't expect me to keep pretending we have some kind of relationship if you're not going to act like a mother. I've been acting like a mother for 32 years, David. I've just stopped acting like an ATM. He walked past me toward the door, then turned back one more time. You know what? Sarah was right about you. She said you were manipulative and controlling, and I defended you. I told her you were just lonely and worried about me. But she was right, you were trying to control me by holding money over my head. The accusation was so perfectly backwards, so completely inverted from reality, that I almost laughed. "Goodbye, David." I closed the door behind him and listened to his footsteps echoing down the stairs. Then I sat in my kitchen and waited to feel devastated. But devastation didn't come. Instead, I felt something I could only describe as relief. The last test had been failed, the last illusion had been shattered, the last hope for change had been buried. But with the death of that false hope came something unexpected: freedom. I was free from wondering if David would change, free from hoping our next conversation would be different, free from the endless cycle of exploitation and disappointment that had defined our relationship for years. For the first time since Frank's death, I was truly alone. But for the first time in years, I wasn't lonely. That evening, Rosa came by with leftover pastels from a family gathering. She took one look at my face and knew something had happened. "David came to see me today," I told her as we sat with our tea. "How did it go?" I told her everything: the seemingly genuine conversation, the gradual revelation of his real purpose, his parting accusation that I was the manipulative one in our relationship. Rosa listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her dark eyes full of compassion and understanding. "You know," she said when I finished, "there's a reason they call it tough love. It's tough. On everybody. But sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do: refuse to enable someone's self-destruction, even when that person is your own child." Do you think I did the right thing? Honey, I think you did the only thing. You can't love someone into loving you back. You can't buy respect with generosity. And you can't build a real relationship on a foundation of financial exploitation. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "And you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is get out of the way and let them experience the consequences of their choices." But what if he really does become homeless? What if something terrible happens to him because I wouldn't help? Then that will be the consequence of his choices, not yours. You didn't create his financial problems, Margaret. You've been solving them for years, and all that did was enable him to make worse and worse decisions because he knew you'd always bail him out. Rosa reached across the table and took my hand. "You gave him 32 years of unconditional love and support. You gave him everything a mother could possibly give. If that wasn't enough to teach him how to treat you with respect, then nothing you do going forward will teach him either." That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my bank and learned about my financial situation, really learned, not just the panicked accounting I'd been doing to figure out how much I could send David each month. The damage was extensive but not irreversible. My retirement savings were mostly gone, but I had enough to live modestly for the rest of my life if I was careful. My social security was enough to cover rent and basic expenses. I wouldn't be taking any luxury vacations or buying any expensive clothes, but I wouldn't be homeless either. More importantly, for the first time in years, everything I earned was mine to keep. I didn't have to factor David's emergencies into my budget anymore. I didn't have to choose between my medication and his rent, between my groceries and his lifestyle. I was poor, but I was free. And freedom, I was discovering, was worth more than I'd ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, I started doing things I'd forgotten were possible. I bought myself a new dress, nothing expensive, just something from the Salvation Army store that made me feel pretty when I put it on. I went to the doctor for a full physical and got glasses that actually matched my current prescription. I bought ingredients for meals I wanted to eat rather than just the cheapest calories I could find. Rosa invited me to join her and some friends for weekly walks in Central Park. I'd lived in New York for decades but had rarely visited the park because I'd always been too tired, too stressed, too focused on just getting through each day. Now, walking along the tree-lined paths with women who laughed easily and shared stories without asking for anything in return, I remembered what it felt like to be part of a community rather than just a source of funds. One Tuesday, as we sat by the reservoir watching the ducks, Rosa's friend Carmen asked about my family. "I have a son," I said without hesitation. "But we're not in contact right now." It was the first time I'd been able to say that without shame, without feeling like I needed to explain or justify David's absence from my life. It was just a fact, like saying I had brown eyes or lived in the Bronx. "That's hard," Carmen said simply. "Family relationships can be complicated. No judgment, no assumption that I must have done something wrong to be estranged from my child. Just acknowledgement that sometimes families don't work out the way we hope they will." It is hard, I agreed. But it's also been liberating in ways I never expected. And it was true. The absence of David's financial demands had created space in my life for things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. I started reading again, books from the library, not just the newspaper. I took up cooking, really cooking, not just heating up canned soup. I bought paints and started working on small canvases, rediscovering a hobby I'd abandoned decades ago when David's needs took over my life completely. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. For years, my worth had been tied to my usefulness to David. When he needed money, I mattered. When he didn't, I ceased to exist in his world. Now, I was learning to value myself for who I was rather than what I could provide. I was a woman with interesting thoughts and creative abilities. I was a friend who could offer good conversation and emotional support. I was a community member who could contribute wisdom gained through experience and pain. I was more than just David's mother. I was Margaret Patterson, 74 years old, still learning and growing and becoming the person I was meant to be. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't finished testing my resolve. In November, just as I was settling into my new life, I received a phone call that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Dr. Williams from Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm calling about your son, David." My heart stopped. Every maternal instinct I'd been trying to suppress came flooding back. "Is he all right? What happened?" "He was in a car accident earlier today. Nothing life-threatening, but he's banged up pretty badly. He'll need surgery on his wrist, and he'll be hospitalized for at least a few days." I gripped the phone with white knuckles. "Can I see him? Is he conscious?" "Yes, he's awake and alert. However, I should mention that he's having some difficulty with his insurance coverage. The surgery he needs isn't fully covered, and the co-pays for his hospital stay are quite substantial." Of course. Even from a hospital bed, David's problems involved money. "Doctor, can you tell me exactly what his medical situation is?" "Not the financial part, just his health." Dr. Williams explained that David had a broken wrist that required surgery to heal properly, some bruised ribs, and a mild concussion. Painful and inconvenient, but not permanently disabling or life-threatening. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, but we'll have to postpone it if we can't get the financial arrangements sorted out by then. I thanked the doctor and sat staring at my phone, every emotion I thought I'd processed flooding back at once. My son was hurt and in the hospital. Everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-respect warred with 32 years of maternal instinct telling me to rush to his bedside and solve his problems. But even in my panic, I could see the pattern. David had been in a car accident, yes. That much was probably true. But somehow, even that crisis had become about money he needed and couldn't provide for himself. I called the hospital back and asked to speak to someone in billing. "I'd like to pay for my son's surgery and hospital stay," I told them. "Wonderful. We'll need a credit card number and, wait. I want to pay the hospital directly. I don't want any funds to go to him personally, and I don't want him to know that I'm the one paying. Can you arrange that?" There was a pause. "That's unusual, but yes, we can set it up so the payment comes from an anonymous source." I gave them my information and paid for David's surgery and 3 days of hospital care. It cost me nearly $3,000, money I couldn't really afford, but money I couldn't not spend knowing my child was in pain. But I also made a decision that would have been impossible for me 6 months earlier. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't call David. I didn't let him know I had any involvement in his care. For 3 days, I worried and prayed and cried. But I didn't rescue. I didn't rush to his bedside to solve his problems and absorb his anxiety. I didn't make his crisis into my emergency. On the 4th day, Rosa found me sitting in my kitchen staring out the window. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey. What's wrong?" I told her about David's accident and what I'd done, both the payment and the decision to stay away. "You paid for his surgery but didn't visit him?" "I know it sounds cold, it doesn't sound cold. It sounds like the most loving thing you could have done." Rosa sat down across from me, her expression thoughtful. "You made sure he got the medical care he needed, but you didn't put yourself back into the cycle of being his rescuer. You helped him as a human being in crisis, but you didn't re-establish the pattern of him using crises to manipulate you emotionally." She was right, but it didn't make it feel any easier. "I keep wondering if he's okay, if he's scared, if he needs his mother." "I'm sure he is scared. But being scared and being alone with that fear might be exactly what he needs to start making better decisions." 3 weeks later, I got a call from David. His voice was different, quieter, less demanding. "Mom? I heard you paid for my surgery." My heart started racing. "How did you find out?" "The billing department made a mistake and mentioned it when I called about my final bill." "Mom, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come see me?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I wanted to make sure you got the medical care you needed. But I didn't come because I knew if I did, you'd find a way to turn your accident into my emotional crisis, and I couldn't handle that." There was a long silence. That's probably fair," he said finally. "I probably would have done exactly that." The admission shocked me. In all our years of conflict, David had never acknowledged that he manipulated me emotionally. "David, are you feeling better? Is your wrist healing properly?" "Yeah, I'm okay. Still hurts, but the doctor says it'll be fine." "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking while I've been laid up." "About what?" "About us. About the way I've been treating you. About why you've been so angry with me." I waited, afraid to hope but unable to keep myself from listening. I think I get it now. When I was in the hospital, scared and hurt and alone, I kept expecting you to show up. I kept thinking you'd rush in to take care of me like you always have. When you didn't come, I was so angry at first. I thought you were being cruel, punishing me for not giving you what you wanted. And now? Now I think maybe you were being kind in a way I couldn't understand before. You made sure I got help, but you let me deal with being scared and alone and responsible for myself. For the first time in my adult life, I had to handle a crisis without you fixing it for me. I found myself crying, not from sadness but from relief. Finally, after all these months, David seemed to be understanding what I'd been trying to tell him. And how did that feel? I asked. Terrible. But also, I don't know how to explain it. Grown up, maybe? Like I was finally dealing with my own life instead of expecting other people to solve my problems. We talked for another 30 minutes. He told me about the job he'd gotten after Sarah left him, a position that paid less but had better benefits. He told me about the small apartment in Queens where he was learning to cook simple meals and budget his money carefully. He didn't ask me for anything. No money, no advice, no emotional support beyond his basic need to reconnect with his mother. Mom, I know I have a lot to make up for. I know saying sorry isn't enough after all the ways I've hurt you. But I want to try to be a better son, if you'll let me. What does that look like to you, David? I don't know yet. Maybe calling you once a week just to talk? Maybe visiting sometimes just to see how you're doing? Maybe asking about your life instead of just telling you about mine? They were small promises, basic kindnesses that most adult children would consider automatic. But from David, they represented a fundamental shift in how he saw our relationship. I'd like that, I told him. And Mom? I want you to know that I'm not going to ask you for money anymore. Not because you won't give it to me, but because I finally understand that taking it was hurting both of us. The conversation ended with tentative plans for him to visit the following weekend, not for any particular reason, just to spend time together. After I hung up, I sat in my chair feeling cautiously hopeful. Maybe David really had learned something from our separation. Maybe the pain we'd both endured had been worth it if it led to this breakthrough. But I also reminded myself that change is slow, and patterns that took years to establish don't disappear overnight. I would be happy to rebuild our relationship if David was genuinely committed to making it healthy, but I wouldn't forget the lessons I'd learned about protecting my own dignity and financial security. The following Saturday, David arrived at my apartment carrying a small bouquet of flowers and a bag of groceries. I thought maybe I could cook dinner for you, he said with a shy smile that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been. We spent the afternoon in my kitchen, preparing a simple meal together. David told me about his new job, about his coworkers, about a book he'd been reading. I told him about Rosa and my new friends, about the painting I'd started, about how different my life felt now that I wasn't constantly worried about money. For the first time in years, we had a conversation that felt natural and reciprocal. He asked about my health, my thoughts, my plans for the future. I asked about his goals, his challenges, his hopes for building a more stable life. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when I could see him struggling not to fall into old patterns, still instances when he seemed to expect me to solve problems he mentioned in passing. But the foundation was different. The assumption that I existed primarily to serve his needs was gone, replaced by something that looked more like mutual respect. As he was getting ready to leave, David paused at my door. Mom, I know I can't undo all the damage I've done to our relationship. I know it's going to take time for you to trust that this change is real. But I want you to know that losing you, really losing you, not just having you angry with me, was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. You didn't lose me, David. You just had to find a new way to see me. Maybe that's the same thing, he said softly. Maybe I had to lose the version of you that existed just to take care of me so I could find the version of you who's a whole person with her own life and dreams. After he left, I called Rosa to tell her about our day. How do you feel? She asked. Hopeful. But also careful. I think he meant everything he said today, but meaning it and being able to sustain it are different things. That sounds wise. You can be happy about today without forgetting what you've learned about protecting yourself. She was right. David's apparent transformation was wonderful, but it didn't erase the years of exploitation that had come before. It didn't mean I should abandon the boundaries I'd learned to set or ignore the financial security I'd begun to rebuild. Real change would have to be proven over time, through consistent actions rather than heartfelt promises. Over the next few months, David kept his word. He called every Tuesday evening, just to talk. He visited every other weekend, bringing groceries or flowers or small gifts that clearly came from his own pocket rather than mine. Gradually, I began to see him as an adult rather than the dependent child he'd been for so many years. He told me about challenges at work that he was handling himself, about financial decisions he was making carefully, about relationships he was building based on mutual interests rather than what people could do for him. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I could see him struggling with the urge to ask me to solve a problem for him, moments when old patterns almost reasserted themselves. But each time, he caught himself and found a different way forward. More importantly, I learned to trust my own instincts about our relationship. When David mentioned a financial difficulty, I offered emotional support and practical advice without reaching for my checkbook. When he seemed overwhelmed by a challenge, I listened and encouraged without taking ownership of his problems. I was learning to be his mother without being his rescuer, to love him without enabling him, to support him without sacrificing myself. By spring, our relationship had transformed into something I'd never experienced with David, a genuine friendship between two adults who happened to be mother and son. He brought me to meet some of his coworkers, introducing me with pride as his mom rather than the embarrassment I'd sensed in previous years. I invited him to join Rosa and me for dinner sometimes, pleased to see him interact respectfully with my friends. Most remarkably, he started asking for my advice about things other than money, work decisions, relationship challenges, personal goals. He seemed to genuinely value my opinions and experience in ways that went far deeper than my ability to solve his immediate problems. One evening in May, almost a year after I'd first set my boundaries with David, we were sitting on the small balcony outside my apartment watching the sunset over the city. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you forgive me? For all those years, for all the ways I took advantage of you?" I thought about his question carefully. Forgiveness wasn't something I could decide to feel, it was something that had grown gradually as I watched him make genuine efforts to change. "I think forgiveness is something that happens over time," I said finally. "Every time you call just to see how I'm doing, every time you visit without needing something from me, every time you treat me like a person instead of a resource, that's part of forgiveness happening." He nodded, understanding that forgiveness was a process rather than a single decision. "I'm grateful you didn't give up on me completely," he said. "Even when you stopped giving me money, even when you refused to see me at the hospital, you didn't close the door forever." "I couldn't close the door forever, David. You're my son. But I had to learn the difference between loving you and enabling you to hurt me." As the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline, I reflected on how much had changed in my life over the past year. I'd learned to value myself independent of my usefulness to others. I'd discovered friendships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. I'd found creative outlets and simple pleasures I'd forgotten existed. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. David had learned too. He discovered that he was capable of handling his own problems, that he could build relationships based on who he was rather than what people could do for him, that independence felt better than dependence even when it was harder. Our relationship now was smaller in some ways than it had been when I was funding his lifestyle. We talked once a week instead of multiple times. He visited twice a month instead of whenever he needed money. Our interactions were less frequent but infinitely more genuine. I no longer felt like I was desperately buying scraps of his attention with my life savings. Instead, I felt like I was enjoying the voluntary company of an adult child who chose to spend time with me because he valued our relationship. The transformation hadn't been easy for either of us. There had been months of pain, loneliness, doubt, and fear. There had been times when it would have been simpler to go back to our old patterns, to resume the cycle of exploitation and resentment that had become familiar. But we'd both been brave enough to endure the discomfort of change, and we'd both discovered that healthy relationships, even between parents and children, require boundaries, respect, and reciprocity. Now, as I approach my 75th birthday, I'm planning a small celebration with Rosa and my other friends. David has asked if he can cook dinner for all of us, his treat, his way of contributing to my happiness rather than just receiving from it. I look forward to the evening not because I'm desperate for his attention, but because I genuinely enjoy his company. I look forward to our weekly phone calls not because they're my only human contact, but because they're a pleasant part of a life filled with other relationships and interests. I've learned that love, real love, doesn't bankrupt you financially or emotionally. Real love enhances your life rather than consuming it. And I've learned that it's never too late to change, to grow, to demand better for yourself, even from people you love most in the world. 6 months ago, if someone had asked me whether my relationship with David could be saved, I would have said no. The damage seemed too deep, the patterns too entrenched, the pain too overwhelming. Now I know that relationships can be rebuilt, but only if both people are willing to tear down the parts that weren't working and construct something entirely new in their place. Sometimes that reconstruction requires a complete separation first, a clearing of the ground so new growth can take root. Sometimes it requires saying no to people who have never heard that word from you before. Sometimes it requires choosing your own dignity over someone else's comfort, even when that someone is your own child. But the alternative, continuing to enable destructive patterns out of fear of loneliness or guilt about setting boundaries, isn't really love at all. It's just a slow form of mutual destruction disguised as devotion. Today I woke up to sunshine streaming through windows of an apartment that belongs entirely to me. I made coffee with beans I could afford because I'm not sending my grocery money to fund someone else's lifestyle. I watered plants that are thriving because I finally have enough emotional energy left over to nurture something other than a one-sided relationship. Tonight I'll call Rosa to finalize our plans for tomorrow's cooking class. This weekend David will visit, but not because he needs anything from me, just because he wants to spend time with his mother. I am 74 years old, and I am finally learning what it feels like to be loved for who I am rather than what I can provide. I am finally understanding that my worth isn't measured by my utility to others, that my happiness doesn't have to be secondary to everyone else's needs. I am finally free. The silence in my apartment isn't empty anymore. It's peaceful. The phone ringing doesn't fill me with dread anymore. It fills me with curiosity about which friend might be calling to share news or make plans. My bank account isn't large, but it's stable. My social circle isn't huge, but it's genuine. My relationship with my son isn't perfect, but it's honest. For the first time in years, I'm not just surviving. I'm living. And I'm discovering that living, really living, with dignity and boundaries and mutual respect, is something you can learn to do at any age, even when you thought it was too late to change. Even when you thought the people who hurt you most would never be willing to grow. Even when you thought you'd never be strong enough to demand better for yourself. You are never too old to choose yourself. You are never too invested in a dysfunctional relationship to walk away from it. You are never too afraid of loneliness to insist on respect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, choosing yourself teaches other people how to choose you too. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where love felt like a transaction? Where your worth seemed tied to what you could provide rather than who you were as a person? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you in any way, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Knowing that my story might help someone else find the courage to value themselves means everything to me. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that we all deserve to be loved for who we are, not just for what we can give.